To be honest, by personality, I'm not much of a crier. But in my career, I think that's been a good thing. I'm a civil rights lawyer, and I've seen some pretty horrible things in the world. In 1994, I was sent to Rwanda to be the director of the UN's genocide investigation. Turns out, tears aren't much help when you're trying to investigate a genocide. The things I had to see, feel, touch, are pretty unspeakable. But what I can tell you is this, that the Rwandan genocide was one of the world's greatest failures of simple compassion. Now, by contrast, I've been involved in one of the world's greatest successes of compassion, and that's the fight against global poverty. I think this is a cause that has involved all of us here. I don't really remember what my first introduction to poverty was, but I do remember my most jarring. It was when I met Venus. She's a mom from Zimbabwe. She has 3 kids and she's a widow. She had to walk 12 miles in the only garment she owned to the capital city to share her story. She described what it was like when the coals on the cooking fire finally just went completely cold. The last drop of cooking oil finally ran out. When the last of the food, despite her best efforts, ran out. She had to watch her youngest son, Peter, suffer from malnutrition as his legs slowly bowed into uselessness. As his eyes grew cloudy and dim, and then Peter finally grew cold. For over 50 years, stories like this have been moving us to compassion. They have moved us not only to care about the fight against global poverty, but actually to do our part to try to stop the suffering. The fight against global poverty is the longest-running manifestation of the human phenomenon of compassion. And so I'd like to share some pretty shattering insight that might forever change the way you think about this struggle. In March of 2015, Gary Hogan inspires the TEDx audience with his moving speech entitled, "The Hidden Reason for Poverty People Need to Address Now." 35 years ago, he told us 40,000 kids died every day because of poverty. That number today is now down to 17,000. Way too many, of course. But this does mean that every year, 8 million kids don't have to suffer from poverty. Moreover, the number of people living in extreme poverty, which is defined in living less than $1.25 a day, has fallen from 50% to only 15%. This is massive progress and exceeds everyone's expectations about what is possible. And I think you and I should feel proud and encouraged that compassion actually has the power to stop the suffering of millions. But here's the part they don't tell you very much about. If we move that poverty mark just up to $2 a day, virtually the same 2 billion people stuck in such harsh poverty are still stuck there, 35 years later. So why are so many billions stuck in such harsh poverty? Until I actually talked to Venus, I would have had no clue that none of my approaches actually addressed why Venus had to watch her son die. "You were doing fine," Venus told me, until Brutus came along and started to cause trouble. Now Brutus is Venus's next-door neighbor, and caused trouble is what happened after Venus's husband died. When Brutus just came in, threw Venus and her children out of their house, stole their land, and robbed their market stall. So you see, Venus was thrown into destitution by violence. And then it occurred to me, of course none of my child sponsorships, none of my microloans, none of the traditional anti-poverty programs were going to stop Brutus. Because they weren't meant to. This became even more clear to me when I met Griselda. She's a marvelous young woman living in a very poor community in Guatemala. The most important thing Griselda and her family can do is make sure Griselda goes to school. But when I met Griselda, she wasn't going to school. In fact, she was very rarely leaving her home. When Griselda and her family were walking home from church in broad daylight, men from her community snatched her off the streets and violently raped her. So you see, Griselda had every opportunity to go to school. It just wasn't safe for her to get there. Around the world, poor women and girls are victims of everyday violence, of domestic abuse and sexual violence. These two forms of violence account for more death and disability than malaria, car accidents, than war combined. So you see, the poor of our world are stuck in whole systems of violence. In South Asia, for instance, I could drive past a rice mill and see a man hoisting 100-pound sacks of flour upon his thin back, but I would have no idea until later that he was a slave of that rice mill held by violence. Decades of anti-poverty programs right in his community were never able to rescue him. In fact, half a century of anti-poverty programs have left more people in slavery than any other time in human history. Experts tell us there are 35 million people in slavery today. I've come to call this epidemic the locust effect, because in the lives of the poor it descends like a plague and destroys everything. In fact, now when you survey very, very poor communities, the residents will tell you that their greatest fear is everyday violence. My first reaction was, we've got to make all these laws against the poor illegal. Then I found out it already is. The issue is not that the poor don't get the laws, but it's that they don't get the law enforcement. They don't get the law enforcement. So you think this basic dish? No. The issue is not that they don't get the laws, but it's that they don't get the law enforcement. In Bolivia, for example, if a man sexually assaults a child, he is at greater risk of slipping in the shower and dying than he ever is for going to jail for that crime. In South Asia, if you enslave a poor person, you are at greater risk of being struck by lightning than you ever are for going to jail for that crime. And so this violence, it just rages on and destroys our efforts to help people out of their $2 a day hells. So you think this basic disgeneration of law enforcement would be the #1 priority in the developing world in the fight against global poverty. But it's not. Auditors of the International Assistance recently couldn't even find 1% of aid going to help poor people from the lawless chaos of everyday violence. A freshwater organization tells a heart-wrenching story about girls being raped on their way to fetching water, and celebrates the solution about a new well that drastically shortens their walk. End of story. But not a word about the rapists still right there in their community. If a girl on one of our college campuses was raped on the walk to the library, we would never celebrate the solution about moving the library closer to her dorm. Yes, for some reason, this is okay for poor people. Now the truth is, experts, they don't know how to stop it. So what do? They don't talk about it. But the more fundamental reason why law enforcement in the developing world is so neglected is because people with money in the developing world, they don't need it. The largest employer on the continent in Africa is now private security. But you see, the rich can pay for it and keep getting richer, but the poor can't pay for it and are left totally unprotected and thrown to the ground. This is a massive and scandalous outrage. Broken law enforcement can be fixed. Violence can be stopped. Almost all criminal justice systems, they start out broken and corrupt, but they can be transformed by fierce effort and commitment. The path forward is pretty clear. First, we have to make stopping violence indispensable to the fight against global poverty. Any conversation that does not mention violence must be deemed not serious. Secondly, we have to seriously invest resources and share expertise as the developing world fashions a new public justice system, not private security, that gives everyone a chance to be safe. You know, from the hindsight of history, the most inexplicable and inexcusable acts are simple failures of compassion. Because I believe history convenes a tribunal of our grandchildren, and when they ask us, Grandma, Grandpa, where were you? Where were you? Grandpa, where were you? Where were you when the Jews were fleeing Nazi Germany and being rejected at our shores? Where were you? Where were you, Grandma, when they were beating our African-American neighbors just because they were trying to register to vote? Likewise, when they ask us, Grandma, Grandpa, where were you? Where were you when 2 billion of our world's foreign population were drowning in lawless chaos? I hope we can say we had compassion. And as a generation, we raised our voice and were moved to make the violence stop.